Imagine this. It's the dead of winter. A blizzard is tearing through your city. Snow hits the windows like gravel, wind screams down the streets, and the whole skyline looks invincible. Until the lights flicker once, twice, and then the grid dies. Inside your modern apartment, energy efficient, tightly sealed, wrapped in plastic vapor barriers and packed with fiberglass, the countdown begins. At first, you tell yourself it's fine. It's only a power outage. But within an hour, the air changes. It feels thinner, sharper. Within 3 hours, you can see your breath drifting like smoke. Within 6 hours, your home isn't shelter anymore. It's a glass and drywall refrigerator. You're under blankets, still shivering, asking the question nobody wants to ask out loud. How long can we last like this? Now rewind the clock 800 years. You step into a stone hall built around 1200 AD. No central heating, no foam, no smart thermostat. The windows are single pane, and yes, drafty by modern standards. And yet, you're not freezing. You're comfortable. Here's the part that should bother you. Thermal imaging tests have shown that during winter temperature swings, some of these old stone structures can stay about 4 degrees Celsius warmer inside than a modern Energy Star home after the heat is turned off. 4 degrees doesn't sound dramatic until you realize it's the difference between surviving the night and watching your body burn through its reserves hour by hour. So how is that possible? How can a pile of 13th century rock outperform modern engineering when the furnace stops? Because for the last 50 years, we've been sold a story about warmth that is only true when the grid is stable. We traded inertia for resistance. We traded breathability for plastic. And we built houses that don't just use energy, they depend on it. Homes that work only as long as the machine is running. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today, we're not just exploring history, we're recovering a lost survival technology. We're going to break down the thermodynamic genius the Middle Ages built into stone, lime, and cloth. The thermal battery effect, the living chemistry of lime plaster, and the forgotten insulation power of tapestries. And most importantly, we're going to translate those principles into something you can use. So if the lights go out, your home doesn't die with them. Now, let's step into the cold. Part 1. The thermal battery versus the plastic box. To understand why your house gets cold so fast, we need to talk about a quiet war being fought inside your walls. A war between two ideas from physics, insulation and thermal mass. Modern homes are built almost entirely around insulation. Think of a thermos or a styrofoam cup. The goal is resistance, high R value. We frame walls with thin wooden studs, stuff the cavities with light, fluffy fiberglass or foam, and then seal everything inside plastic. The logic sounds airtight. Slow the escape of heat, keep the cold outside, and the house stays warm. But here's the flaw no one warns you about. Insulation does not store heat. It only delays loss. A modern wall has no memory, no momentum. The moment your furnace shuts off, that wall has nothing to give back. It isn't warm. It was never warm. It was just slowing the leak. Once the heat source dies, the temperature inside collapses fast. What you're left with is an empty shell. Now look at an 800-year-old building. Medieval builders didn't care about R values. They cared about mass, density, weight. An 8-inch solid stone wall weighs around 2,400 kilograms per cubic meter. That's not a divider between indoors and outdoors. That's a thermal battery. Here's the survival physics they understood instinctively. When the sun shines during the day, or when a fire burns at night, that stone doesn't fight the heat. It absorbs it. The energy sinks deep into the material, spreading slowly through millions of tightly packed molecules. Stone doesn't resist heat, it eats it, and because it's dense, it holds an enormous amount of energy. Hours later, when the fire fades or the outside temperature crashes, the wall is still charged. Heat begins migrating back toward the colder interior surface, releasing slowly into the room. This delay is called thermal lag, or phase shift, and it can take 6 to 10 hours for that stored warmth to move through the stone. While a modern home spikes hot and then drops like a cliff, the stone building rides a long, steady wave. It cools slowly, predictably. It has inertia. This is why, when the grid goes down, the modern house feels cold in minutes, while the medieval structure can stay livable for days. But here's the critical warning. This is where many modern survivalists oversimplify and get it wrong. Thermal mass is not magic. In a place that is permanently freezing, with no sun and no fire, even the thickest stone wall will eventually equalize with the cold. A stone bunker without heat becomes a refrigerator. Mass alone cannot save you. The medieval builders knew this, and that's why they didn't rely on stone by itself. They paired it with something just as important, and far more forgotten: a way to control moisture and protect that stored heat from being stolen by damp air. That forgotten technology is what we're stepping into next. Part 2. The Gore-Tex of the Middle Ages. If you live in a modern home, there's a good chance you're living inside something that behaves a lot like a plastic bag. We wrap our houses in vapor barriers to keep moisture out. Plastic sheets, sealed drywall, tight construction. On paper, it sounds logical. Stop water from getting in and you stop damage. But moisture always gets in. It comes from cooking, from showers, from breathing, from simply existing inside a closed space. And once that moisture slips past the barrier, it has nowhere to go. It condenses behind the drywall, soaks into insulation, and quietly turns your wall into a damp sponge. That's where sick building syndrome begins. Rot, toxic black mold. And here's the part most people miss. Wet walls are cold walls. Damp insulation loses its ability to hold heat. Moisture doesn't just make your house unhealthy, it steals warmth. 13th century builders didn't have plastic. What they had was something far smarter. They used lime plaster. At first glance it looks simple. White, chalky, almost fragile. But lime plaster is one of the most advanced building materials humanity ever invented. Unlike modern cement or gypsum, which seal a wall shut, lime plaster breathes. Its microscopic pore structure allows water vapor to move freely through it. Not liquid water, vapor. In modern terms, it behaves like a high-performance outdoor jacket. Waterproof when it needs to be, breathable when it matters. It is, quite literally, the Gore-Tex of the Middle Ages. And here's why that matters for warmth. Lime plaster actively regulates humidity. When the air inside a house becomes damp and cold, the lime absorbs excess moisture. When the air dries out, it releases that moisture back slowly. This constant balancing act keeps the wall dry. And a dry wall holds heat. Moisture is one of the fastest ways to drain thermal energy. By removing dampness from the air and the wall itself, lime plaster protects the stone's ability to store and release warmth. It keeps the thermal battery efficient. But the story gets even more impressive. Lime plaster is autogenous. That means it heals itself. When a hairline crack forms, rainwater dissolves free lime particles in the plaster. That liquid seeps into the crack, reacts with carbon dioxide in the air, and crystallizes back into stone, sealing the damage without human intervention. It's not a coating, it's a living surface. Now compare that to modern drywall. Gypsum is chemically neutral, mold loves it. It's essentially an all-you-can-eat buffet once moisture appears. Lime, by contrast, has a pH between 12 and 13. It's highly alkaline. Mold cannot survive on it. Bacteria cannot thrive. The wall actively resists decay. So while modern homeowners fight a constant battle against dampness, mold, and heat loss, the occupant of an 800-year-old building lives behind a breathable, self-healing, antimicrobial skin. A skin that keeps the walls dry. And walls that stay dry, stay warm. This is the part of medieval engineering we didn't just forget. We replaced it with plastic and paid the price in cold, sickness, and dependence. And once you understand this, the next question becomes unavoidable. If stone stored the heat and lime protected it, how did medieval builders stop that warmth from being stolen by cold stone walls themselves? The answer isn't in the masonry. It's hanging on the walls. Part 3. The lost engineering of tapestries. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or more precisely, the tapestry on the wall. When we walk through castles or museums today, we see tapestries as art, decorative, symbolic, knights, unicorns, faded stories from another age. But to someone living in the 13th century, a tapestry was not decoration. It was technology, high-performance textile engineering designed to keep human bodies alive in stone buildings that never truly stopped exchanging heat with the outside world. Here's the problem medieval builders faced. Stone is an excellent thermal battery, but it can feel brutally cold to the touch. Stand next to a cold stone wall and your body starts losing heat toward it, even if the air temperature isn't extreme. This is called mean radiant temperature. Your skin doesn't care how warm the air is. It cares what it is radiating heat toward. The medieval solution was deceptively simple. They hung heavy wool or linen tapestries an inch or two away from the stone. That small detail changes everything. First, wool itself is a remarkable insulator. Its fibers trap millions of tiny air pockets that slow heat loss. But the real genius lies in what's behind it. That narrow gap between the tapestry and the wall creates stagnant air. Air that doesn't move, doesn't convect, and doesn't steal warmth. Stone, air gap, textile, body. A layered system. Recent research into historic interiors revealed a statistic that should make modern builders uncomfortable. A properly hung tapestry can improve the effective thermal insulation of a stone wall by up to 40%. 40%. Think about that. Today, people spend tens of thousands of dollars tearing open walls, spraying foam, and sealing houses tighter and tighter. Medieval households achieved massive thermal gains by hanging fabric. So why did we stop? Why are our walls bare, white, and exposed? It wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate killing. In the early 20th century, modernist architects like Adolf Loos declared that ornamentation was a crime. They rejected texture, softness, and layering. They demanded clean lines, empty walls, and visual purity. But there was something they never admitted. Their minimalist vision only worked because of fossil fuels. Radiators powered by coal and oil could brute force heat into space. As long as energy was cheap and endless, walls no longer needed to help you survive. Rugs, curtains, and tapestries were rebranded as clutter, obsolete relics of a colder past. So we stripped our homes naked, and for a while it worked. But now energy prices rise, grids fail, power becomes fragile again. And suddenly, we're realizing what those medieval builders already knew. Those decorations weren't decoration at all. They were life support systems. And once you understand that, another truth becomes unavoidable. Stone stored the heat. Lime protected it. Textiles kept it from being stolen. But none of that mattered unless people lived differently inside those spaces. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How medieval homes were used, not just how they were built. Part 4. The heat engine, zonal living. There is one final piece to this puzzle, and it has nothing to do with materials. It has everything to do with how space is used. Modern homes are obsessed with the open concept. Vast rooms, kitchens bleeding into living rooms, ceilings pushed higher and higher. We try to heat the entire volume of air inside a house to a perfectly even temperature, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, everywhere, all at once. From a thermodynamic standpoint, this is madness. Air is one of the worst things you can try to heat. It moves, it leaks, it rises. The moment you warm it, it escapes upward and outward, pooling uselessly near the ceiling. In an open-plan home, heat doesn't settle, it disappears. And when the power goes out, that massive volume of air becomes a liability. Your warmth is diluted, stretched thin, and lost in minutes. Medieval buildings worked from a completely different logic. They didn't try to heat the structure. They didn't try to heat the air. They heated people. A building from around 1200 AD was designed around strategic zones. Warm zones, cold zones, transitional zones. No one expected the entire castle to be comfortable in winter. That would have been impossible. Instead, they created a heat engine at the core of daily life. That engine was the kitchen. It was compact, enclosed, built with thick walls that absorbed the heat from constant cooking fires. That heat didn't vanish into high ceilings. It was trapped, stored, and slowly released. Living spaces clustered close to it. Sleeping chambers were often placed directly above it, so rising warmth could pass upward through floors and stone. This wasn't accidental. It was precision design. They understood something we forgot. Radiant heat matters more than air temperature. A fire warms stone. The stone warms the wall coverings. The wall coverings warm your body. Comfort wasn't about numbers on a thermometer. It was about proximity, enclosure, and heat exchange. In a modern blackout, your open-plan home works against you. Heat spreads thin and dies fast. Every extra cubic foot of air becomes another enemy, pulling warmth away from your body. In the medieval home, when winter pressed hard, you retreated inward to the warm core. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, thicker boundaries, spaces designed not for appearance, but for survival. This is the lesson that ties everything together. Stone stored the heat, lime protected it, textiles kept it from being stolen, but zonal living decided whether that heat saved lives or vanished into empty space. And once you understand that, you're ready for the most important question of all. If we can't rebuild castles, if we can't tear down our walls tonight, how do we apply 800 years of survival wisdom right now using what we already have? That's where history stops being interesting and starts being useful. Part 5. Survival Skills for the Modern Age. So here we are. The power is out. The furnace is silent. Your modern drywall box, the one that worked perfectly yesterday, is failing you tonight. You can't rebuild your home with stone walls and lime plaster before morning. You can't redesign the floor plan. But you can apply 800 years of hard-earned survival knowledge starting right now. History doesn't help us by being admired. It helps us by being used. The first lesson is to recreate the tapestry effect. You may not own medieval wall hangings, but you almost certainly own blankets. Don't just wrap them around your body, hang them, especially on exterior walls and over windows. You're not decorating, you're building layers. Fabric traps air, and trapped air slows heat loss. If things are desperate, bubble wrap becomes your emergency stained glass. A little water on the window lets it cling in place, bubbles facing the glass, creating a stagnant air layer that works like crude double glazing. It looks ugly. It works beautifully. The second lesson is zonal living, taken to its logical extreme. Stop trying to heat the whole apartment. Choose the smallest room you have. Close the doors. Seal the cracks underneath with towels. Then go one step further. If the cold is severe, build a room inside the room. A camping tent set up on your bed turns your body into the primary heat source it has always been. You generate roughly 100 watts of heat just by being alive. In a large space, that energy vanishes. Inside a tent, it accumulates. the temperature rises. This is medieval thinking applied with modern gear, the ultimate microzone. The third lesson is the thermal battery hack. If you can generate heat at all, boiling water, a small heater used safely and with ventilation, don't waste it on air. Heat mass. Hot water bottles are ideal, but socks filled with rice work in a pinch if you can warm them safely. Place them under blankets near your core. They release heat slowly over hours, just like stone walls do. This is thermal mass at human scale, and it works when nothing else does. The final lesson is humidity control, and it's one of the most overlooked. A damp house always feels colder than a dry one. Moisture steals heat from your body and your shelter. Without breathable lime plaster, you have to manage it manually. Don't let sweat accumulate in your clothes. Vent layers when you move. Change damp garments. Wool can forgive moisture, cotton cannot. Staying dry is not about comfort. It's about survival. None of this is theory. These are principles that kept people alive long before power grids, gas lines, and thermostats existed. They don't require perfection. They require awareness. Stone taught us how to store heat. Lime taught us how to protect it. Textiles taught us how to keep it close. And zonal living taught us how to use it wisely. If your home feels fragile tonight, that's not a personal failure. It's a design choice made for a different world. But resilience doesn't start with rebuilding walls. It starts with understanding physics and working with it. And once you do, the cold loses much of its power. Conclusion: the future is the past. We're taught to think of the past as cold, dark, and uncomfortable. We imagine the Middle Ages as a time of misery, where people endured winter rather than lived through it. But the thermal evidence tells a very different story. The builders of the 13th century understood something we've largely forgotten. Resilience is not about overpowering nature. It's about cooperating with it. They built homes that worked with heat instead of fighting it. Walls that stored warmth like batteries. Skins that breathed instead of trapping moisture. Textiles that stopped heat where it mattered, at the human body. Nothing was accidental. Every layer had a job, and every material played its part. What they created wasn't primitive, it was stable. Our modern homes, by contrast, are miracles of convenience, but they are fragile. They depend on a constant flow of electricity and fuel. They work beautifully right up until the moment they don't. When the system fails, the comfort collapses fast, because the house itself holds almost nothing. So maybe the house of the future shouldn't look like a sealed plastic machine or a spaceship dropped onto the landscape. Maybe it should look a little more like a castle. Maybe we need to bring back mass, bring back lime, bring back layers, and yes, bring back the tapestries. Because when the storm hits and the lights go out, physics doesn't care about efficiency ratings or smart thermostats. It cares about how much heat you can store, how slowly you lose it, and whether your shelter can stand on its own. So what do you think? Would you trade drywall for stone? Have you tried any of these survival principles yourself? Let us know in the comments. This is Historia Prime, reminding you that sometimes the way forward begins by looking back. Stay warm and stay curious.